Thank you. My name is Ben Feinstein. I'm a director with the SecureWorks Counter Threat Unit. The CTU, as we're known, is a group of intelligence analysts, malware analysts, and security researchers that basically manage SecureWorks protections for our clients and make sure that we are protecting our clients against the latest threats and the latest attacks out there. I'm glad to be here at DeepSec. This is the second year that we have sent somebody from the CTU to speak at this event, and we think it's a very valuable event, and I'm happy to meet a bunch of folks here. So what are we going to talk about today? So a brief outline of the discussion is going to be just talking about social networking sites and social networking systems, and specifically the risks that those introduce to enterprises and to individuals. I'll also be discussing particular historical attacks against social networking systems and how they've worked out. Also, we'll be going through a discussion of some problems that Twitter has had in the past year or so, and some attacks that they've suffered on their systems, and also just some general kind of stupidity that some Twitter users have demonstrated in terms of giving up their credentials. We'll be talking in depth about how Twitter's authentication schemes work, and specifically how you authenticate to their website interface and how the client applications for Twitter authenticate. We'll be doing a little bit of discussion of how Twitter can be used for botnet command and control, and we'll wrap up with some ideas for some areas of future research. So social networking, you know, what discussion of Twitter would be complete without talking about social networking? You can't really make it out there, but that t-shirt there says you were hotter on MySpace, and that tends to be the truth. So social networking, when I think of social networking, you know, from my perspective as a security researcher and incident responder, I kind of think of it as in terms of a social disease here. These systems tend to be highly interactive. You have sort of interactions like Facebook pokes, instant messaging, direct messages, customized user profiles with rich content, multimedia, dynamic scripting such as JavaScript can be embedded in these profiles. All sorts of rich content, plugins, gadgets as they're called, you know, third-party applications that can plug into your profile. And one of the big problems is a lot of users of these systems have a misplaced perception of intimacy and trust as they're interacting with users in these systems here. You know, it creates a false sense of security almost, or a false sense of trust as you're interacting with other users in the system that may actually be your friends or colleagues in the physical world, but you're interacting with them in this electronic kind of system. So other issues that social networking sites and systems present is there's really a blurring of boundaries. One, in terms of technical boundaries, such as security or trust boundaries of a formally defined system. But other issues are a lack of personal boundaries. That's not really a technical issue, but it's demonstrated in the sort of information that people seem willing to share with these systems that they may not be comfortable sharing actually in the physical world. And also, as you look at it, you can sort of see these networks in terms of graph theoretic properties, in terms of degrees of separation from different nodes in the graph, and also in terms of the connectedness, if you're familiar with these computer science graph theoretic terms, the connectedness of nodes in the graph in terms of you know, how connected you are to other nodes. And the reality is that most of the most heavily connected nodes are not really real people. They're typically marketing or PR operations acting on the behalf of a VIP, a celebrity, a politician, or a corporation. So typically the most connected nodes aren't actual human beings using these systems. So another issue here is these things really leak your personal identifiable information like a sieve. The ACM, Association of Computing Machineries, workshop on social networking this past year, there was a great paper presented, and it's actually, the whole text is available online if you just Google for it, talking about how social networking sites present a risk of personally identifiable information. The authors of this paper talked about how third parties can use things such as tracking cookies that are common techniques among advertising systems to actually tie your social profiles or your social network accounts to your web browsing activities and to build a more full profile of you. Typically, this is done for commercial purposes to better target advertising and have a higher yield on advertising, but it also is very useful for an area known as open source intelligence gathering. This is in contrast to covert intelligence gathering. Open source intelligence gathering is going to use public databases, public information, search engine indexes, all sorts of information that's out there in the public domain to build a profile of a target individual or a target organization. So if you contract with a good pen tester to perform what's known as a full spectrum penetration test, this kind of open source intel gathering should be part of it as they try to target a project, an individual, or organization. And then for adversaries or for black hats out there, this information you can gather from these sites is very useful for targeted attacks and spear phishing. For instance, if you are interested in people that worked at Apple on a particular project in a particular office, you may be able to identify a handful of people or even one single individual that you have reason to believe is involved in that project. And if your goal was to, for instance, steal information regarding that project as an industrial espionage kind of operation, you may have gathered enough information on this target that you can successfully socially engineer them or launch a targeted attack on that person and retrieve the information that you're after. As I discussed a little bit before, with all this rich web content and user-submitted content, there's a high risk for all sorts of web application vulnerabilities, cross-site scripting all over the place. If you just Google the names of major social networking sites in XSS, you'll find a long history of XSS vulnerabilities that have been publicly disclosed and then fixed in a lot of these sites. Cross-site request forgery. A lot of these systems, particularly Twitter, offer a nice RESTful API that you can interact with their systems through this API. And this is great when you have CSRF, because then you could you can make posts on the user's behalf, or rather the user makes posts on your behalf, and they can update profiles, send messages, change content on their site using a simple web post that you can do through active scripting or JavaScript. A lot of these profiles support rich media that is going to utilize a browser plugin, be it Flash, Shockwave, Java, QuickTime, all these kind of things. And what this does is really open you up for wholesale client-side exploitation. These sites are actually great environments if you're looking to find a large victim population for client-side exploits. And also they present a target-rich environment for social engineering, as I said, because of the false sense of intimacy and the amount of information that's out there on these individuals. So here's from July 5th, 2005. This is was in the press here. Basically, the head of the UK's MI6 intelligence agency traditionally goes by a code name, and his identity is held secret for security reasons. His wife had a Facebook profile, and she had actually gone in and she had set some decent privacy settings for her Facebook profile. What she had also done is she had joined a London metropolitan area geographical group inside Facebook. And what she did not understand, and what wasn't clear to a lot of people, is that privacy settings of geographical groups would basically take precedence over some privacy settings for general profile restrictions. So she posted on her Facebook how proud she was that her husband had just been appointed to head the Secret Intelligence Service of the UK. And this was published to publicly. His identity was revealed. It was a very embarrassing episode for this organization, and I'm not sure whether he is still in that post or what they've done with this, but it obviously exposed the identity of this individual. This is a little bit minor compared to the covert organizations, but back in October 9th, a gentleman with Microsoft Research by the name of Robert Morgan posted a little bit onto his site about the projects he was working on. I believe it was LinkedIn. And one of the things he revealed is that he's hard at work on building 128-bit support into next generation Windows core code. And so the press seized on this as, wow, Microsoft just revealed that they're working on a 128-bit operating system. probably could have predicted that, but it could get a lot worse than this, obviously, if you're revealing details of a sensitive project that you're working on in an organization. So to go in a little bit on some historical attacks against these social networking systems, really some of the main targets here historically have been MySpace, and as it's lost a little bit of popularity and Facebook has gained more precedence and Twitter has as well, these attacks have kind of moved between the different social networking sites. So who all here is familiar with the Sammy MySpace worm from 2005? Okay. Well, good, then this won't be too much review. The 19-year-old gentleman by the name of Sammy Kamkar, I believe he's a resident of Los Angeles, California, decided that he really wanted a lot of friends on his MySpace page, like a lot of friends, millions of friends. And so he found some problems with some blacklisting that MySpace was doing in terms of preventing JavaScript in these tags. He found some evasions that could work around their blacklisting filters. So he created a wormable cross-site scripting payload and updated it to updated his profile with this payload. And what happened was when someone viewed his profile with this script on it, excuse me, the JavaScript would execute in the context of the victim's browser, who's logged into MySpace at the time. It would alter their profile to display the string, but most of all, Sammy is my hero, in their profile. It would go and send a message to all of the victim's friends in MySpace containing that cross-site scripting payload. It added that victim to his friends list, and then it also then infected their profile with the malicious payload. So within about 20 hours of unleashing this worm, this is 2005, over 1 million users had run the payload and become his friend. And this was actually one of the fastest spreading computer viruses. I mean, virus might be a misnomer, but computer worms, computer viruses in history. 20 hours, 1 million hosts or user accounts had been infected. MySpace obviously swung into action, performed incident response, cleaned up the issue, disinfected all the profiles, and then filed suit against Kamkar. So Sammy pled guilty to a felony charge in January 2007. He was sentenced to 3 years probation, 90 days of community service, and had to pay undisclosed restitution to MySpace to help compensate him for the damages he did. And this is a graph from hackers.org that was tracking this as it went along. And it's kind of rough, sort of crappy Excel graph there, but you can see this explosion around 800 minutes since he initially deployed the worm. And before MySpace shut him down, he had topped 1 million users right there. At the end of the data was over 1 million users. And Sammy was blogging about this on his own blog as this was ongoing. So this source here is Sammy Kamkar himself. This is a screenshot he took and posted to his blog. The rough kind of Photoshop work is his own work. And you can see he's bragging about all the attractive women that are now his friend on his MySpace. And you can barely see it, but up top, where he points out the number of friends, 919,000, he says, "Please don't press charges," in his screenshot on his blog. Unfortunately, MySpace did not heed that request. So just recently, in September '09, there was a month of Facebook bugs. And an anonymous gentleman going by the handle The Harmony Guy spent a lot of time analyzing Facebook or third-party Facebook applications. And he coined this new term for vulnerabilities, FAQs, Facebook Application XSS and Cross-Site Request Forgery. He identified over 9,700 different third-party Facebook apps that were vulnerable to this combination of cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery. Fully over half of those had been certified Facebook verified applications by the Facebook team that examines these things. So in terms of the set of vulnerable applications he discovered, 6 out of the top 10 were the most popular apps in all of Facebook that accounted for over 218 million users, active users per month. So 218 million users were using vulnerable applications per month, as he identified. It also, 7 of the top 10 developers by popularity and volume of product had these issues. All these vulns were patched I'm not sure how you would run a disclosure process with 10,000 different applications, but somehow he managed to notify these application developers and have it fixed. And then on to less technical attacks, social engineering. These social networking sites are great because the viral propagation network, or viral propagation nature of communicating through them. And also things like Twitter's trending topics can be used to enhance the social engineering effectiveness of an attack. The attacker can programmatically look at what the hot topics are of discussion that day or that hour, and then craft messages, spam, that leverages these popular topics and might look more topical, more interesting to someone that receives it. Particularly the Kubeface family of malware has been utilizing this technique a lot. They'll socially engineer you into going to a site to view a video, and they've set up fake YouTube sites, essentially a YouTube phishing site, and then it'll socially engineer you. You must install the new flashplayer.exe to view this content. And of course, it's not Flash Player, it's actually a Trojan downloader, first stage, and it will pull down whatever malware the bad guys are getting paid to install that day. So on to Twitter. So Twitter has been experiencing tremendous growth. And one of their strategic areas of growth has been in SMS subscribers in developing nations. So they just recently, September, they closed a large round of financing from Bharti Airtel. I believe it's an Indian mobile provider that has 110 million subscribers on that network that can now use SMS to interact with Twitter. They also just signed a deal with Axis Indonesia, which is in November, which is a large mobile provider in Indonesia. I don't know how many subscribers they have, but I suspect it's rather large as well. And they've also just recently inked some partnerships with MySpace and AOL to further integrate their platform with profiles and systems of those. So talking about some historical failures of Twitter, and this talk is about Twitter, so we're kind of singling them out, but as we just saw, there's no shortage of attacks and failures and vulnerabilities among all the major social networking sites and really all the major Web 2.0 properties. So back in April 2008, McGrew Security disclosed a cross-site request forgery. It was very, very simple at the time. When you viewed McGrew's page, it would post an update to your timeline saying that you've been owned by, you've been owned by McGrew's CSRF. Back in July 2008, I believe it was Damon Cortese, who goes as DA Court on Twitter, found a Twitter staging server. I think it was called just staging.twitter.com. It was publicly accessible. There was no authentication on it. And basically, it gave you access to SQL debugging and sort of internal application staging systems of Twitter. He responsibly disclosed this to Twitter, and they rolled out an incomplete fix. They deployed HTTP authentication onto the interface. They put some IP-based access controls in place, but they forgot to deploy these controls onto the HTTPS version of the page. So if you just went to HTTPS and then staging.twitter.com, you're back in the system, and they fixed that. So there was an experiment, I believe it was performed by an employee of Google, I don't know his name off the top of his head, called Twitter Rank. And he said, let's just see if I put up this really basic, just plain black and white HTML page called Twitter Rank. And if you give me your Twitter username and password, I'll give you your Twitter rank, and how cool are you on Twitter? And he just sent it out, and all sorts of people start coming to his website and started just entering in their username and password and getting their Twitter rank. Of course, the Twitter rank was a completely bogus random score that he just spit out. But this was kind of an experiment in social engineering. And so lucky for these people, he was performing a security research experiment, and he was not malicious. So Damon Cortese one-upped this project and created Twitter Awesomeness, which is obviously better than Twitter Rank. And so here's a screenshot of the Twitter Awesomeness page. And he got several hundred passwords very quickly off this. And it'll tell you how awesome you are if you just provide your credentials. And then down here, you probably can't make it out, but he put a disclaimer on the page in red, and the disclaimer says, I'm in your Twitters, stealing your creds. It's okay, 259 other people gave me their passwords too. Please note, if you haven't noticed, this does not really calculate your awesomeness. People kept using this and providing their credentials to him. This is not a Twitter fail, this is a human fail right here. So back in December 2008, Twitter debuted a user search feature. And this had been a feature that was in high demand of their user base. And they hadn't really had a good way to find users and do good searching across their user base. As soon as they debuted it, Damon Contesi put a very, very simple, the most basic cross-site scripting in there. And this is a screenshot courtesy of Damon, who's been very helpful here. And he sees the payload says, "Oh noes," when you type in the cross-site scripting into their search engine and their search feature there. This has obviously been fixed as well. December 2008 brought some nasty info disclosure problems to Twitter. There was a vulnerability in terms of how the Twitter API was working and how it was storing data into a JSON object. And so what had happened is that third-party sites, when you visited them, if you are a Twitter user and some of that information is cached in your browser, they can access parts of your Twitter profile. This is violating the perception of single origin and that other sites shouldn't be able to read data that's cached in your browser from a completely different website. And here's the payload here. It uses a combination of Twitter's API, the RESTful API, and a JSON callback. So you can actually just call getJSON, and you give it the URL to the Twitter timeline of a user, and then you define a callback function. And all the callback function is it accesses this data array .user.screenname. And so that was pretty interesting. People set up websites where they would just list everybody that visited the website. Are you a Twitter user? Yes, and what your username is, and what your last tweet was, actually. May 2009, I believe, the administrative interface to Twitter had a set of credentials that were compromised. It might have been just admin.twitter.com. It was accessible to the internet. One of the flaws here was that Twitter support and Twitter employees, if you had a problem in Twitter, you could tweet them and they'd come in and you'd see their Twitter employee name account, and they'd be helping you out solve your problems. Well, those accounts actually were linked to the administrative accounts for the Twitter corporate backend. And so I believe a French, well, I'm not sure if it was a French person, a hacker, I have his name or his handle in another slide, posted to a French language forum that he had successfully compromised the administrative interface and published some screenshots showing what he could do. And it turned out the password that he guessed or socially engineered was happiness. And so reportedly, this account, the administrative account, belonged to Jason Goldman, who's a director of product management at Twitter. And reportedly, this was the same password he was using on his Yahoo Mail, which then got them into the Twitter administrative systems. So here's some screenshots that he took and posted to this French language forum. What you're looking at here is the administrative page for the Britney Spears user. This is actually, this is God mode for Twitter. You can impersonate users, you can tweet on their behalf, you can delete and suspend accounts, you can change passwords, all sorts of fun to be had. And so you can see Britney's had some problems with password resets and password hijacking. You can see the ticket history on the left-hand side. And then it's also interesting to note that for celebrities, it appears that Twitter gives you VIP service. They will actually interact with you on the telephone. There's a PR person who's running Britney's site, and you can see in the ticket notes, Crystal, the account was hijacked. Crystal called Lauren, who must be the PR rep for Britney Spears, gave her her personal cell phone number if she had any further trouble, and reset the password for her. So it appears that if you're a special person, you're treated a little differently than the average Twitter user. And they obscured is actually Britney's IP address and her Gmail address, or the Gmail address of whoever is running her PR operation there. This right here is Ashton Kutcher's page. He uses AOL for email. and he uses TweetDeck for his posting. And the other interesting thing is you could see a little bit of users that he's blocked or chosen to block. And I'm not sure what it is, but there's a lot of variations on something about his father there. There's Drunken Stepfather, Ashton's father, Ashton's daddy are users that he's blocked. And he also blocked Perez Hilton for whatever reason. Here's Barack Obama's administrative page. The IP, again, the IP and the email address are obscured. And you could see a lot of password changes were occurring early in January 2009. I'm not sure whether someone kept hijacking the password or what, but soon before his inauguration, he had some problems on this profile. You could also see that the first user that wanted to befriend him and he decided to block is KKK for life. Right there. So the Mikey Twitter worm, cross-site scripting worm, April 2009, Twitter suffered a really nasty cross-site scripting worm outbreak over the Easter holiday. So the potential victim would receive a tweet saying, hey everyone, join stalkdaily.com, it's a site like Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. So this was a competitor to Twitter that had launched a cross-site scripting worm within Twitter to solicit new users for their system. So the link would take you to a page that served up a cross-site scripting attack payload, and it caused your profile to send similar Twitter messages to all your contacts. As a side note, also ongoing in April 2009 was the so-called race to 1 million on Twitter. What this was a race to see who could be the first person on Twitter to have 1 million followers. It was a very, very close battle between Ashton Kutcher and 4chan, but 4chan got cut off just before they reached the finish line by the Twitter security team. 4chan had actually scripted up all the captchas, scripted up the account creation process. They weren't just listing friends, they were creating hundreds of thousands of Twitter accounts and joining up to the designated 4chan champion who was going to defeat Ashton Kutcher. So here's a screenshot of the payloads from the Mikey Twitter cross-site scripting worm. You could see all these people have been infected with it. They're tweeting out to their contacts this payload here. That link will take you to a cross-site scripting payload that will then infect your profile and further propagate. And here's the payload of the attack. It's interesting to note, Twitter had implemented some cross-site request forgery mitigations in terms of a token, but this goes to show you that in the presence of a cross-site scripting worm, these cross-site request forgery tokens are useless, essentially. And you can see here, authenticity token, he scraped it off the initial request, so that didn't work. And basically, he did a little bit of trick, URL encoding his payload, and then he had the free web hosting with x.js that served up his payload there. And he kept using several variations of this. He whacked a few thousand accounts early in the morning. Twitter swung into action, shut him down. That afternoon, he launched another variation of the worm with a different parameter and a different obfuscation. So over 2 or 3 days, Twitter would shut him down, patch the hole. He'd jump back in there with a new cross-site scripting payload until finally they shut him down for good. So here's the confession of the gentleman that was behind this, Mikey, on the Stalk Daily website, which was the site that he created. And he says, I have came clean and have accepted the responsibility for the worm. Read the interview here. And he performed an interview with some news site. And here's a public statement that was posted on Twitter's corporate blog talking about the stalkdaily.com worm and reassuring their users that their passwords and phone numbers and sensitive information were not compromised as part of this attack. Someone launched another worm called the Cleaning Up Mikey worm. What this worm would do is it would remove the payload from infected profiles, and then it would tweet out to the contacts, Twitter, hire Mikey, and it had Mikey's home phone number, personal phone number there. So they were cleaning up after him, but they were a little sympathetic and say, hey, this kid's smart, give him a job. Otherwise, he's going to keep getting in trouble. And here's a picture of Mikey himself. Looks a little gothy, kind of. Probably a teenager, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure what happened to him, whether he faced any lawsuits or any criminal penalties, but you can see down at the bottom, he posted his cell phone and his home numbers. Call me, it's my real number. So I mentioned earlier KubeFace. KubeFace is sort of a worm, a family of malware, and a system of social engineering attacks. Initially, it was really leveraging MySpace and Facebook, but in the summer of 2009, the organization behind KubeFace began to actively target Twitter. They released a module. The KubeFace is a very modular piece of malware, and they released a module for KubeFace that was allow it to propagate through Twitter. It would retweet the payloads, and here you can see these fake YouTube links. I mentioned before, I showed that false YouTube page. And so this is Twitter spam that you might see KubeFace spam that you might see on Twitter. Anybody ever received something like this? Come watch my cool video from somebody, a friend of yours? I guess not, or you won't admit it. So here's a screenshot of that fake YouTube site you might be redirected to. Looks a little bit like YouTube. That pop-up right there says you're going to need to get the latest Adobe Flash version. It gives you an EXE. It's a Trojan downloader. It's actually quite effective social engineering attack there. So many people may have heard about the use of Twitter during the protests around the contested election in Iran this past June. The Twitter service was microblogging service was being used to coordinate the activities of the student protesters because they were very limited in the communication they could use internally in Iran. But interestingly, the government began using Twitter as well and allegedly created fake protester profiles that would draw in and identify those that were sympathetic to the protesters. Twitter was also used to spread all sorts of disinformation during those protests, false locations for rallies, false information about who was arrested, who was free, and also was used to actively map the social networks and the contacts of these individuals. This is a screenshot from the Perturba Maltego tool. Maltego is a great tool for open source intelligence gathering. It does all sorts of network visualizations. So what you're looking at here, and Petronas Analytical is a website devoted to non-governmental organizations and information security. So this in the center node here is a Twitter profile known as AJE_producer. AJE producer was allegedly impersonating an Al Jazeera English television producer. And this profile was tweeting out all sorts of messages to other people connected with the Iranian protests, urging them to contact him directly via phone or email so they could be interviewed for Al Jazeera and tell the world what's really going on. It's believed that this was actually a profile operated by the Iranian government with the purpose of identifying people that were sympathetic to the protesters. And what this graph shows is it shows the recent direct conversations with 20 other nodes from AJE producer, and then the next degree of separation where they communicated that information to 1 degree out. So that's basically 2 degrees of separation from this one false profile, allegedly false profile. And here's a case of some disinformation being spread during the Iranian election protests. Iran source and Iran source 45 are believed to be the same individual due to the identical content of the tweets they were sending. They're the dominant nodes in this graph because they were directly sending tweets to other users, and they would directly reply to other users' questions and tweets. And then you see that cluster of 5 nodes there. That's a group of anti-spammers or anti-disinformation operators that were trying to counter the operations of these 2 Iran source accounts there. So hopping back to some problems that Twitter had faced, we're kind of going down the timeline here. So this past July, actually I'm not sure if it was Twitter's CEO, it was the founder named Evan Williams, his wife and other Twitter employees were targeted by Hacker Crawl, who was the same individual who got into the administrative interface in May. Again, he posted some information on a French language forum, and he collected 310 internal documents, zipped them up, and sent them to various media outlets. These documents included, meeting notes, partner agreements, financial projections of the corporation, information about employees, their meal preferences, their calendars, their phone logs, email addresses. And reportedly, Twitter was using the Google Documents cloud-based Office suite to manage this information. And through some unknown mechanism, the password to one of their founders was compromised. And he hopped through other accounts, including the guy's wife, and got their email and some other things. Interestingly, only one media outlet chose to publish any of these documents. TechCrunch published a selection of the documents, redacted some of the information, and faced a good bit of criticism in the community for publishing these pilfered documents. They felt that their position is that these documents had enough news value and that they did not publish the sensitive documents and they redacted some information. So they felt that as a news organization, it was their duty to spread the news. So month of Twitter bugs, July 2008. Avi Raff, who's a great security researcher out of Israel, I believe, decided to just designate July as one of these month of bugs. And he did not actually investigate Twitter itself. He focused on third-party sites that integrate with Twitter. These are like your TwitPics, or there's a huge range of sites that integrate with Twitter. And what he found was that actually there was a lot of vulnerabilities out there, a lot of really basic cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, but a lot of these sites were quite responsive and would fix the issues within hours of being reported. So there's issues, but the folks were being pretty responsive and were addressing them in a good time frame. And then September '09, this meme about how to hack started spreading around Twitter. Basically, again, it was a link to a fake Flash player that redirected you there through a bit.ly shortened URL. And so TwyGuard is a service operated by Errata Security out of Atlanta, Georgia, and they monitor Twitter for worms and attacks of this nature. So they detected this campaign very early on, and the campaign ran for about 92 hours. It involved about 36,000 tweets and about one and a half clicks per link. So that is that for every spammed link that this worm sent out, it was clicked on about 1.5 times, which can be told, bit.ly has an interface where you can track all the clicks that this link has. And here's another one of those kind of user fails here, bestfollowers.com. So there's been many incarnations of this website under many different names. What it is it's a website that says if you provide your Twitter username and password, they guarantee you're going to get a lot of followers. So this is attractive for people that are utilizing Twitter for their business, to promote a book, to find a job. It's a good thing, and they want lots of friends, and they see this as a shortcut to getting lots of followers. And you can see they have a disclaimer on the site, and it says, disclaimer, our site does not phish accounts. Any content on this site may not be 100% accurate. And then by using this site, you agree needfollowers.com, a previous incarnation, is not to be mentioned or involved with any legal matters. Okay. And so here, if you want to opt out, you change your mind, you don't want this system anymore, well, you got to give them your username and password to opt out. If you want to join the VIP service, which they'll get you between 400 and 1,500 followers a day, just give us your username and password to Twitter. So what happens when you actually sign up for this great service? Well, you start advertising it to all your friends, right? And you can see here, these are tweets that were sent out by accounts that had been compromised through this social engineering attack. And it's kind of virally propagating the meme that I finally found the best way to get tons of followers for free. And then it takes you a link to this site where your friend will provide their username and password. Another social engineering scam that was interesting on Twitter is the Twitter porn name. So if I don't know if you could still find it through the searches, but for a while there was a hashtag called Twitter porn name. And what people were doing virally through Twitter is they would supply the name of their first pet and either the name of the street you grew up on or the name of the head teacher in your school. So what kind of questions do you get asked when you access financial records and accounts and reset your passwords and like pet names and streets you grew up on and schools you went to? So people were inadvertently revealing their secret questions, basically, to the whole world with their Twitter porn name. And so it's great if you look for this hashtag, you can just collect a database of everybody's secret questions and stuff, and there's some value to that. Here's a tweet about the Twitter porn name. And it's okay, because the guy who started it, he says, it doesn't save any personal information. It's okay. Not to worry. So another interesting attack, if you remember, summer 2008, I believe. No, excuse me, that's not the right date. So there was this armed conflict between the Republic of Georgia and Russia. There was a political blogger who went by CYXYMU. I'm not going to try to pronounce it if I could. And he was sympathetic to the Republic of Georgia in their conflict with Russia. And he was posting on some various blogs, and he was also tweeting information that was critical of the Russian side of this conflict. So hacktivists that were sympathetic to the Russian side launched a denial of service attack that essentially took down Twitter on August 6th. And it's unclear, there's some allegations this was an email-based Joe job where the hacktivists used their botnet to spam out links back to this guy's profile. And there's some other people saying, no, this was a run-of-the-mill brute force DDoS. But organizations that were monitoring the Twitter network, their data is not consistent with that. And then other people speculate that there was something more sophisticated going on with this DDoS, that the hacktivists had discovered some resource consumption problems on the Twitter side and could, without much force, actually cause a DDoS here. This was covered in the Washington Post and some other outlets there. So now to some technical meat about Twitter and its security. So there's really two authentication schemes that Twitter supports today. The legacy authentication mechanism is HTTP basic authentication. Anybody here familiar with HTTP basic auth? HTTP basic auth is essentially all it is username, password, base 64, and you put it into an authentication header in your HTTP requests. So obviously, since base 64 can just be decoded, you're sending your credentials in the clear. So it relies on the use of SSL TLS to provide for confidentiality, integrity, and those things. The preferred mechanism and the new mechanism is called OAuth. OAuth is it's kind of like a federated authentication system. So instead of having to provide your username and password to third-party sites and third-party applications, instead you authorize them to act on your behalf, and they store a OAuth authentication token that's generated by an OAuth essentially system maintained by Twitter. And so to begin using OAuth in your application or your site, you have to go and you have to register yourself with Twitter. Typically, give a corporate name or a business, or reveal your identity. I want to create an application and use OAuth. And Twitter is encouraging the migration onto OAuth, but it's a big challenge. There's tens of thousands of Twitter applications out there. I believe the majority of them continue to use basic authentication, and so Twitter is in this tough position where if they just from on high turned off basic auth, they have just broken all sorts of client applications. Their user base has just been slashed. That's real money they're losing. And so they're in a tough position. How do you encourage this migration without being heavy-handed, whacking your user base, and pissing off all your developers? So as I see it, God was able to create the world in 7 days, but only because he didn't have an installed user base. And so that's kind of like the position that Twitter's in. They've got a massive installed user base. They can't just disable this legacy authentication system. There are over 10,000 applications that currently support OAuth, however, so it is gaining in popularity. And I don't know what I would recommend for Twitter, like how they can effectively put pressure on their developers to adopt OAuth. It's a tough position. But OAuth isn't really a silver bullet. It's a dramatic improvement over username and password authentication in the clear. But you know, the permission set is quite broad. When you authorize an application or a site to act on your behalf through OAuth, you give it read permission or you give it read-write permission. The problem with this is that Twitter actually has more granular permission systems itself. You have direct messages, which are supposedly private messages between two accounts. People can mark their account as protected, which means that you know, you can't just befriend them. You have to go through an authorization or approval process. Well, OAuth, the permissions are not granular enough to represent that. So when you grant read permissions to OAuth, they can read all your private DMs. They can read, you know, they can access the list of all the secret friends you have that you don't want people to know about. And so there is a tool out there from Damon Cortese to blow away your DMs, but they're pretty much there forever. And once you grant read access, they've got access to everything in your profile. And read-write, they can change anything in your profile. So you are putting a lot of trust in the third-party application or site. So the way it works is that you authorize these sites, and they get a token back from Twitter that they then store, and they can use that credential token. And it's not your username and password. It does not reveal your username and password. But to the back-end authentications of Twitter, you have granted that site the ability to act on your behalf, either read or read-write. And so Twitter is a botnet command and control mechanism. So back this past summer, I was thinking about some ideas for interesting research. I had just started using Twitter a few months before and found it pretty intriguing and pretty interesting environment. So I postulated that it would be possible to use Twitter as a distributed and resilient command and control mechanism for botnets. So I wrote up my CFP submission to DeepSec, and one of the aspects I plan to talk about into research and was to build a proof of concept Twitter command and control mechanism, just basic, just to show that it could be done. Well, you know, when I started looking deeper into this, at DEF CON 17, a guy by the name of Tom Eston gave a talk and introduced this tool, Kraos C2, which is actually an open source implementation of a Twitter-based botnet command and control mechanism. So they did the work for me. You know, there's already a project out there apparently that implements this. And so, you know, soon after, in August '09, a botnet was discovered in the wild actually using this technique. Jose Nazario from Arbor Networks discovered this and reported it to Twitter and wrote, there's a great write-up by Jose, if you Google for it, about this Twitter botnet with command and control. It was quite simple architecture. The ideas I was thinking about were more sophisticated, multi-layer, resilient to take down, all sorts of stuff. It's very simple. There was a single account that was the bot master, essentially, called update, with some, you know, leet speak in there. And what it would do is it would send out base64 encoded URLs of shortened URLs, typically bit.ly URLs, in tweets. And then the URLs, when you base64 decoded them, would lead you to a blob of base64 encoded text. If you then decoded that text, you would get a PK-zip archive. Inside that archive is a UPX-packed info stealer Trojan that's been identified as Buzos, B-U-Z-U-S. And so there are several layers of indirection there, and basically bots could just follow the public timeline of the update botnet master account and find the payloads that they were supposed to be pushing out that day to their victims. It was very easy actually to take this down. You know, you can see, here's a screenshot from Jose Nazario, and you can see these base64 encoded strings that update is tweeting out. But it was pretty easy to take down because, one, you know, it's not usual for people to post base64 encoded blobs to their tweets. And two, what we did is we started looking for any tweet submissions that had http://base64 encoded in it. So that would say there's probably a URL base64 encoded in this tweet. That's pretty suspicious. So let's talk about how you actually authenticate to the Twitter website. So if you just go to twitter.com, it'll load the home page and login form in clear text. If you go to https, twitter.com, it'll load it with HTTPS, and you'll still have the HTTPS URL. Either way, the form submission of your login and password goes over HTTPS to this twitter.com/sessions URI you can see there. So either way, it's going to submit your credentials through HTTPS to the website. And what it also does is it sets, when you first load that page, it sets a CSRF token called authenticity token. It's a long random hexadecimal value that you can see at the bottom there, hidden form field as part of the form submission. As I mentioned earlier, that's used to mitigate CSRF attacks. But the problem is that in the presence of an XSS vulnerability, that kind of CSRF mitigation is completely ineffective, as Mikey showed with his worm. What it also does is it sets another form field called signin_q. I'm not quite sure what that's used for. But interestingly, even if you go to the HTTPS URL and you log in and you post your credentials through HTTPS, you log in and it loads the page back and redirects you back to the clear text version. And Morgan, I checked this last night, or actually this morning, and it does do this. It will redirect you back to the clear text version after you authenticate securely. So what's happening is it's passing this Twitter_session cookie back and forth in the clear. And you can't help it. You can go to HTTPS, you can bookmark the HTTPS site, doesn't matter, it's going to drop you back to clear text. This cookie is set to never expire, and I really hope that when you log out it invalidates the cookie, but I'm not sure. So this is a perfect attack surface for like sidejacking is the term, or cookie hijacking, session hijacking. You're passing this session cookie back and forth in the clear. It never expires, as far as I can tell. So pretty big risk right there. And as we talked about earlier, the basic HTTP basic authentication versus the OAuth authentication, right? Well, most apps are still using the basic auth. So I looked at some Twitter apps, and I'm not going to name names right now because I have not gone through a responsible disclosure process with the authors of these applications, but it's easy enough to reproduce these results yourself. So the applications I looked at, the Twitter apps, at least tried to use HTTPS. So they were using basic auth, but they'd do HTTPS to the Twitter API, the RESTful API, and get the data that way. Problem is, though, that if for whatever reason the HTTPS URL was unavailable, the apps would silently fall back to clear text with no visual indication whatsoever to the user that they've just exposed their credentials on the wire. So if you want to verify this or reproduce this, it's as simple as adding an IP tables rule to send a reset when you see something go to port 443 at Twitter. And actually, twitter.com always resolves to one IP address, depending on where you're at. So for testing, it's pretty easy. Resolve twitter.com, add an IP address, destination IP of Twitter, destination port 443, send a reset. Try your application, sniff the wire. You'll see your credentials go out. And then also, there's haphazard validation of SSL server certificates. This is a area where a lot of applications get it wrong. And they don't properly validate the certificates. This past year we've seen all sorts of interesting attacks on SSL. Moxie Marlinspike is here somewhere at DeepSec, where these implementations really weren't doing what they're supposed to do when it comes to properly validating these certificates. So it's not too surprising to see that some of these third-party applications don't do it right. So back to security of these Twitter client applications. So the Twitter RESTful API supports 4 different output formats, and you can specify what format you want when you request from the API. One is there's some custom Twitter XML document types. They support JSON, they support RSS, and they support Atom. So what happens is these applications use third-party code for parsing if they know what's good for them. And there's a history of vulnerabilities in third-party code for these kind of things. So wouldn't it be interesting to exploit a system via a maliciously crafted Twitter timeline that comes back to this application, and you exploit, for instance, one of the vulnerabilities to be found in libxml2 or something of that nature. And what I've shown in the prior slides is it's not hard to become man in the middle here. It's not hard to set up the evil twin Twitter service and to actually return maliciously crafted API responses here. So the questions are, how well maintained is the parsing code in these applications? Are they statically compiling in old crufty versions of these libraries? If not, if they're actually dynamically linking against these third-party libraries, then it's, maybe the victim's machine is not up to date. They have some vulnerabilities in these libraries. And the problem is these Twitter apps are exposing an attack surface to these third-party libraries that aren't normally exposed. We found some applications. TweetDeck was discovered at the Sector conference up in Toronto, Canada, to not consistently use HTTPS. When you did the integrated profile viewing feature in TweetDeck, it would send out your credentials in the clear. And this surprised a lot of people because all the other API calls through TweetDeck actually used HTTPS or attempted to use HTTPS. And eventually TweetDeck fixed this once the level of user animosity and complaints got very, very high on their forums. They made some attempts to shut down the forums. People were complaining, you got to implement SSL, this is wrong. They shut down that topic, and eventually they fixed it, though. Real quickly, URL shorteners, I think are probably a good security or security vulnerability and an attack surface there. The adoption of these URL shorteners has really been driven by these microblogging services. If you're limited to 140 some odd characters, URLs can really eat up a lot of that. But what it does is it adds one more layer of indirection and obfuscation to the actual link that you're following. Maybe that's not so important because people just tend to click on whatever damn link you send them anyway, and they'll happily type in their username and credentials to whatever site you send them to, as we've seen. But it does obscure where you're going to for people that actually look at these URLs. A lot of these things have been found to have XSS flaws. If you go look through the month of Twitter bugs, all these different sites, Bitly and other sites, they found tinyURL was running Apache as root and all this other stuff. So the URL shorteners have some problems. So to wrap up, some areas for some further research I think is promising. Looking at software exploitation of Twitter client applications via maliciously crafted Twitter API responses. Weaponizing some session hijacking tools around the Twitter website authentication. I think OAuth needs to get some more security eyes on it. It's a relatively new technology. It's pretty promising, but it needs some more vetting and some more research to really harden it, I think. One question is, in the trust model of OAuth, what activities would be allowed by a malicious or a compromised OAuth provider? What kind of actions could they pull off? So really, we're kind of scratching the surface here of some of these attack surfaces. I wanted to give a shout out to my friend from DC404, Ken Chen, out here. I wanted to encourage all you to go check out Ken's talk about hacking Apple firmware tomorrow at 16:30 in the Pirouette room. I also wanted to give a plug out to Freeside Atlanta, who's Atlanta, Georgia's very own hackerspace. Not as quite as cool and elite as MetaLab is yet, but maybe someday. And I also wanted to give a deep round of applause and thanks to all the organizers and staff for tour of DeepSec. Renee, Mikhail, Manuela, and all the other staff for putting on a really well organized and high quality conference. And I'd like to thank them for having me. If you have questions, I'll be around. I'll be around the conference later today and tomorrow. Please feel free to pull me aside. We could exchange emails or whatnot. And thank you for your time.